Posthumous fame. Shakespeare's plays, as we know from numerous sources, enjoyed noisy success with the audience of public theaters. Let us recall the words quoted by Shakespeare's contemporary, Anthony Skolker, who wrote in 1604 that Shakespeare's plays touch the heart of the vulgar elements. In 1640, the poet Leopard Digges recalled the former glorious days of the Globe. "I myself saw," he recalled, "when Caesar appeared on the stage, when Brutus Cassius stood before one another, half revealing his swords. Oh, how delightful the audience was! They left the theater, full of astonishment." According to Digges, Ben Jonson's boring, though finished tragedies receded into the shadows, as viewers preferred to see Shakespeare's Othello. When Falstaff appeared, continues Digges, Prince Henry, Poins and the rest, it was impossible to find a place in the theater, everything was packed full of jam. As for the learned connoisseurs of literature, their attitude to Shakespeare was twofold. As we have seen, these experts appreciated the two early poems of Shakespeare. But it is remarkable, the further Shakespeare went on the path of dramaturgy, the deeper became the choir of praise. Ben Jonson felt the greatness of Shakespeare's genius. "It belonged not to one era, but to all times," wrote Ben Jonson in a poem attached to the first collection of Shakespeare's plays of 1623. But along with this, in a conversation with Drummond, in January 1619, Ben Jonson remarked that Shakespeare lacked art. "I remember," wrote Ben Jonson, "the actors often told and set Shakespeare in credit that whatever work he wrote, he never erased a single line. My answer was this: it's a pity he did not cross out their thousands. It poured with such ease that at times it would be good to stop it." The playwright Beaumont, Fletcher's ally, claimed that in the best lines of Shakespeare there is no scholarship, and marveled at how a mortal man can go far in the dim light of one nature. In the middle of the 17th century, Fuller, the author of Worthy People of England, compared Shakespeare to an unpolished Cornwallian diamond, sparkling with natural brilliance. Much deeper understood or, more correctly, felt the greatness of Shakespeare, some of his comrades on stage. Hammond and Condell, of whom we have already spoken, in the preface to the collection of Shakespeare's plays of 1623, noted the wide availability of his works. "From the most educated to those who can hardly be dismantled," he wrote, "he was a successful imitator of nature and a noble exponent of it. Read it therefore, read it again and again. And if you do not fall in love, you will be in danger of never realizing it." So, these actors of the Globe realized that it is not enough to read, but you need to reread Shakespeare. You guessed about the depths not yet revealed in his works. Milton in his famous poem, Allegro 1632, contrasted scholarly coterie Ben Jonson, the sweetest Shakespeare, the son of fantasy, singing to him given to nature wild forest songs. To the second collection of Shakespeare's plays of 1632, an anonymous poem was attached. The author of this poem speaks of Shakespeare, a plebeian child. From his high throne he creates the whole world and rules it. He acts on mankind with secret springs, arousing in us that compassion from which the heart is compressed. Powerful love, it ignites and extinguishes in we our joy and anger, it sets the senses in motion, it changes us in heavenly fire, stealing us from ourselves. So the force of Shakespeare's influence became clear already in those Goths. We saw that even during Shakespeare's lifetime, during the reign of James I Cool, the public theaters began to decline, giving way to closed theaters. In 1642, during the era of the English bourgeois revolution, all theaters in London were closed by decree of the so-called Long Parliament 1640-1653, in which the majority were Puritans. In 1660, when Charles II ascended the throne of England, the owl of the executed Charles I, the theaters were again opened. But these were completely different theaters. From the former Globe with its noisy crowd, who decided the success of the play, there was no trace left. The very nature of the performances has changed, in which, among other things, female roles have already been played by actresses. One of the first female roles performed in England by an actress was the role of Desdemona. But the main thing, the legislator in this theater was the court aristocracy. The detachment of drama from the masses was coming to an end. In the arguments of the famous poet and playwright John Dryden, 1631–1700 about Shakespeare, Ben Jonson's accusation is already familiar to us, with an excess of nature, the lack of art. In other words, Shakespeare proceeded from life, and not from the glorified samples of ancient literature. Dryden, incidentally, was particularly upset by that in describing the death of Troy in Hamlet, mention is made of a wheel hub from the chariot of fortune, a rag on Hecuba's head and a blanket around her loins. Dryden ironically notes that the poet speaks as if he had served as an apprentice to a chariot or a rag. The first alterations of Shakespeare appear familiar to us. William de Venens in 1666 remade Macbeth, introducing in this tragedy songs and dances and turning it into a fantastic extravaganza. Remade Shakespeare and Dryden. Tate in 1681 remade the King Lear. He based the plot on the love of Edgar and Cordelia, reducing, according to the requirements of classicism, to unity the two plot lines of the Shakespearean play, the tragedy of Lear and the tragedy of Gloucester. Moreover, he crowned his play with a happy ending. Since it was unseemly to see a clown next to the monarch, Tate completely threw out the last of the King Lear. It is remarkable that on the English stage the fool in King Lear resurrected only in the 30s of the XX century. This is how the false Shakespeare appeared in the world, discharged into the garments of tawdry theatricality, far from the people's viewer, whose ghost still has to be contested by the actor on stage and by Shakespeare's commentator. And yet in that era an important step was taken in the mastery of Shakespeare. The famous English actor Thomas Betterton played Hamlet's role in the course of his many years of acting to a very old age and did much to promote the great tragedy. In 1710 Lord Shaftesbury called Hamlet the most popular play of the English repertoire. Betterton passionately carried away Shakespeare. He was the first pilgrim in Stratford, where he went, unfortunately, too late, to collect information about Shakespeare from the old-timers. Shakespeare's autograph. In the XVIIIth century in England firmly established the glory of Shakespeare as the first writer of his homeland. Numerous editions of his works are published, to which no less numerous comments are written. Appear the first researchers of his work. The greatest English actor of the XVIIIth century, David Garrigue, 1717–1779, glorified the name of Shakespeare and outside of England. At the same time, there were critics in England too, who, accepting Shakespeare from the standpoint of classicism, accepted his work far from unconditionally. In the XVIIIth century works of Shakespeare began to penetrate into other countries. In France, where classicism dominated, to Shakespeare as a whole is unhappy in family life, we are likely to have gotten at least vague rumors about this through oral tradition. And we ask ourselves the question, do we not here deal with that irritation on especially close people, which often covers patients who are afflicted with a serious ailment? Shakespeare's signatures on the testament sheets indicate that his hand was trembling at that time. Shakespeare left money to buy a ring, emblems of memory and friendship, Richard Burbage, as well as two other stage companions, Hammond and Condell, who later, in 1623, released the first collection of Shakespeare's plays. John Ward, who was a priest in Stratford from 1662 to 1681, wrote in his diary, probably from the words of the old-timers, that Shakespeare, Ben Jonson and the poet Drayton, had a gay meeting and at the same time, drank too much was the cause of Shakespeare's death. Biographers assume an attack of the thoracic toad, a disease that, incidentally, affects many actors. Shakespeare died on April 23, 1616, just on the day when he turned 52 years old. He is buried in the Bedford Church. Above his grave are written poems, "Conjure not to touch his ashes." The original tradition attributed these verses, or rather, the verse, to Shakespeare himself. But they are written very badly. It is more likely that they belong to some local virtuoso, composing epitaphs. It is natural to assume that this verse in his lines expounded the will of the deceased. The case was rather cold, or even simply hostile. Shakespeare's plays were going on in France in alterations, among which Dicewise's alterations were especially popular. The latter carefully expelled from the works of Shakespeare everything that seemed to him vulgar. So, for example, he replaced a handkerchief in Othello with a diamond diadem. With the plot, Ducis was very unrelenting. He did not dare to give a white girl to marry a black Moor. In his alteration she was only the bride of Othello. In Germany, in the 18th century, along with the ardent admirers of Shakespeare, writers also appeared, remaking it. Among the fans we mention Wieland, Lessing, Goethe. In his novel Agarthan, Wieland praises in Shakespeare a mixture of dissimilar elements, that is, precisely what the representatives of classicism so severely criticized Shakespeare. Shakespeare, writes Wieland, of the only one of all poets since the time of Homer, who knew people from king to beggar well, from Julius Caesar to Falstaff, they are being blamed for the fact that in his plays there is no plan, that the comic and the tragic in him mixed in the strangest way, without realizing that it is in this respect that his plays represent the true picture of human life. These words were sympathetically quoted by Lessing in the Hamburg drama, while noting that Shakespeare, and not representatives of French classicism, is the true continuer of the poetic realism of the ancient Greek tragedians. "I do not remember," wrote Goethe in Wilhelm Meister, "that a book or event of my life should produce such an irresistible impression as Shakespeare's plays. These are not poetic works. Reading them, with horror you see before you the book of human destinies and hear how violent whirlwind of life with a noise turns over its sheets. His works are like a watch from a pure crystal, so that at one time you see both the course of time and the whole mechanism of their movements. This is an insight into the inner world. A man prompted me to come closer to the world reality and to draw from this inexhaustible source." The era of Romanticism has given a lot in the sense of revealing the emotional richness of Shakespeare's works. In England, Coleridge, Lamb, Hazlitt. In Germany, Schlegel and Tieck. In France, Stendhal and Victor Hugo, who wrote a book about Shakespeare, fought for their ideals and art under the banner of Shakespeare. It is impossible not to mention here also the wonderful actors of the Romantic school. English tragedian Edmund Kean, 1787–1833, shocked the audience with his inspired play in the roles of Othello, Glamilga and Shylock. Although his game was extremely uneven, the bright-ups were followed by falls. Seeing Kean in Shakespeare is the same as reading Shakespeare with lightning flashes, Coleridge noted. The 19th century created world fame for Shakespeare. His works have been translated into many languages. The best actors of the world necessarily included Shakespearean roles in his repertoire. About Shakespeare was written countless works. Shakespeare was one of the favorite writers of Marx and Engels. He was very fond of poetry, writes Lafargue of Marx, read Aeschylus in the Greek script and considered him and Shakespeare to be the two greatest dramatic geniuses that mankind had born. Shakespeare, whom he respected unlimitedly, Marx made the most thorough study and knew the most insignificant actors of his dramas. The Marx family dominated a cult of the great English playwright, Paul Lafargue, Karl Marx. For personal memories. With regard to the works of Shakespeare, they were required reading in artillery. He wrote Karl Marx's daughter Eleanor Marx Aveling, Karl Marx, a quick note. K. Marx and F. Engels on Art, M. Art Publishing House, 1937, p. 661. IBID, p. 660. In Merry Wives' first act alone, there is more life and movement than in all German literature. Only Loans with his dog Crab is more worthy than all the German comedies put together, wrote Engels to Marx 10 December 1873. IBID, pages 260-251. To Marx and Engels belong the deepest in the world literature of Shakespeare's assessments, which are the key to understanding Shakespeare's creativity. Paramount importance in this respect are related to the 1859 letters of Marx and Engels to La Salle about his tragedy, Franz von Sickingen. They reveal the main aspects of Shakespeare's dramatic art: his profound realism, his ability to broadly portray the era, revealing its main driving forces, creation of complex and relief characters. IBID, pages 171-180. In Russian literature, Shakespeare's name first appears in 1748 in the poem of a representative of classicism, playwright and poet Alexander Sumarokov. Before the author there are creators worthy of fame, among them Shakespeare, although unenlightened, adds Sumarokov and immediately gives the following note: Shakespeare is an ugly tragedian and comedian, in which both very lean and extremely good. Died April 23 in 1616, in the 63rd year of his century. In the same year, Sumarokov's tragedy Hamlet appeared. In this tragedy, as it was believed in the playwrights of classicism, the characters that are raised to the goats do not speak, but recite, do not go, but walk. Hamlet Sumarokova has little to do with the Shakespearean tragedy. Suffice it to say that Sumarokov's events end happily. Hamlet marries Ophelia. However, Sumarokov himself wrote that his Hamlet on Shakespeare's tragedy hardly resembles, and yet this was the first appearance in Russia, if not Shakespeare himself, then at least a modified shadow of him. In 1772, the last monologue of Romeo was published in the journal Vechera, probably Sushkovoy's translation. In 1783 in Nizhny Novgorod an unknown translator was translated into prose from the French, Richard III. In 1787, Julius Caesar appeared in the translation of Gromsen. The famous historian and writer premised his translation on the foreword, which even now, especially if we remember that this was the first critical article about Shakespeare in Russia, amazes with the strength and courage of generalization. That Shakespeare, wrote Gromsen, did not stick to the rules of theatrical, the true reason for this, I think, was his ardent imagination, unable to obey any regulations, his spirit hovering like an eagle, and could not measure his steam with the measure the flight of his sparrows. His genius, like the genius of nature, embraced his eyes with both the sun and the atoms, and with equal skill he portrayed both hero and the fool, the clever and the madman, Brutus and the shitter. His dramas, like the immeasurable Naturtheater, nevertheless together makes the perfect illo not requiring correction of the current theater of writers. Gromsen was far ahead of the theater writers of his time, who soon began to correct, that is, Shakespeare's alteration. At the beginning of the XIX century, Shakespeare was on the Russian stage only in alterations, Othello Veliaminov, Lear Nedich, Hamlet Viskovotov, largely inspired by the above-mentioned remixes of Dionysus. But Russian readers, meanwhile, became more and more familiar with Shakespeare, and in the press writers and critics who explained the depth and significance of his work increasingly appeared. Among the latter were, by the way, the future Decembrists, Kuchelbecker and Bestuzhev. Kuchelbecker, calling for the creation of original national literature and objecting to blind imitation of foreign models, also pointed to the need to learn from the great Shakespeare. Mnemosyne, 1824, Part 2. Kuchelbecker's article, on the direction of our poetry, especially the lyric in the latter decade. Kuchelbecker, In addition, translated a number of Shakespeare's plays. Sent by the Tsarist government to Siberia, Kuchelbecker often returned in his diary to Shakespeare. In Shakespeare, Kuchelbecker writes in his diary on April 18, 1833, "It's amazing the mix of gaiety and importance, laughter and sorrow. In this connection, it seems, should look for the main distinctive sign of humor, and so Shakespeare, no doubt, the first humorist with whom no other can compare." One of the best pages of not only the Russian, but also the world Shakespearean is Pushkin's statements about Shakespeare. These statements amaze with their penetrating and all-embracing depth. Here are some of them. "Read Shakespeare, this is my refrain," wrote Pushkin in 1825. "He is never afraid to compromise his character, he forces him to speak with all the vital ease, for he is sure that in his time and place he will make this person find a language appropriate to his character." Pushkin, Volume I, Volume I M. L. 1926, pages 148 and 478. But it's hard to shake Shakespeare in his Othello, Hamlet, Measure for Measure, and so on the dignity of a large nationality. Pushkin, Complete Works, State Publishing House of the Literary Literature, 1934, Volume Vi, p. 19. The Courage of Invention, Creation, where the plan is full of creative thought, this is the courage of Shakespeare, Dante, Milton, Goethe and Faust, Molière and Tartuffe. Pushkin, Volume Vi, p. 22. In his preface to Boris Godunov, Pushkin often mentions the father of our Shakespeare and writes the following remarkable words: "I firmly believe that our theater is decent in the folk laws of the Shakespearean drama, and not the court custom of the tragedy of Racine." In 1837, N. Polvoy translated Hamlet. This was the first theatrical translation of Shakespeare into Russian. Vronsenko's translation of Hamlet in 1828, though more precise in detail, was more intended for the reader than for the stage. According to the translation of Field, the role of the Danish prince was played by the great Russian actor, inspired and fiery Mokolov, whose execution is described by Belinsky in his remarkable article, Hamlet, Shakespeare's Drama. Mokolov as Hamlet. Belinsky often returned to Shakespeare, whom he passionately loved. It can be safely said that the great Russian critic laid the foundation for all further development of advanced Shakespearean thought in Russia. Belinsky first of all pointed to the depth of the content of Shakespeare's works. Usually they refer to Shakespeare and especially Goethe, wrote Belinsky, as a representative of free, pure art, but this is one of the most unfortunate indications. Shakespeare is the greatest creative genius. The poet is mainly in this, there is no doubt, but they are bad understand him who, because of his poetry, does not see the rich content, inexhaustible mine of lessons in facts for the psychologist, philosopher, historian, statesman, etc. Shakespeare transmits everything through poetry, but transferred to them far from being of the same poetry. At Belinsky. Complete Works, ed. S. Vengerov, i.e. The She. p. 1917, p. 103. Look at Russian literature in 1847. Since the 40s of the XX century, the popularity of Shakespeare in Russia is beginning to grow rapidly. Even a brief description of the development of this popularity would require a separate book. Suffice it to say that the annotated bibliography of essays and articles written about Shakespeare in the 19th century in Russia contains more than 20 printed pages. By the 60s of the last century, all the works of Shakespeare were translated into Russian, many of them several times. Among these old translations there are remarkable works. For example, Hamlet by A. I. Gronberg, King Lear and Coriolanus by A. V. Druzhinin, Remembrance of the Wayward, The Taming of the Shrew by N. Ostrovsky. An exceptional role in the mastery of Shakespeare in Russia was played by translations of N.K.H. Ketcher, 1809-1886. On April 23, 1864, Turgenev's speech, Turgenev himself was abroad at the time, was read at a solemn meeting, which was dedicated to the 300th anniversary of the birth of Shakespeare. "We Russians," said this speech, "celebrate the memory of Shakespeare, and we have the right to celebrate it. For us, Shakespeare is not only a loud, bright name, which is worshipped only occasionally and from afar. He became our property, he entered our flesh and blood." Is Turgenev, Works, Geekl, Volume XII, L. M. 1933, p. 219. Sayings about Shakespeare. Classics of Russian literature and criticism: Pushkin, Belinsky, Turgenev, Dobroliubov, Chernyshevsky, Maxim Gorky, entered the Gold Book of World Shakespeare. Performances of Shakespeare's roles by the classics of the Russian stage: Mokolov, Yermolova, Fedotova, Lensky, Yuzin, Kachelov, are the biggest events in the history of the world theater. In the second half of the last century, Professor N. I. Storozhenko, professor of the Moscow University, initiated the academic Shakespeare studies in Russia. During the years of Soviet power, the popularity of Shakespeare in our country has increased immeasurably and in unprecedented scale. It is generally recognized that the works of the classics of world drama are placed in the Soviet Union more often than in all other countries taken together. This applies primarily to Shakespeare. During the years of Soviet power, about 1.5 million copies of Shakespeare's plays were published. For the first time, in the history of our book, the collection of Shakespeare's works was published in the English language in the USSR, and certain of his plays with detailed dictionaries and commentaries were published in English. Some of Shakespeare's works have been translated into 27 languages of the peoples of the Soviet Union. The point, of course, is not only in quantitative indicators. Before the Soviet readers and viewers, the very essence of Shakespeare's work was revealed with particular clarity. For us, Shakespeare is not only a contemplator of life, as portrayed by some foreign Shakespearean scholars, but also a fighter for high humanistic ideals. If he knew how to love, then he knew how to hate. Let us recall with what ruthless consistency he exposed the villain Iago. Let us recall the passionate speeches of Timon, the tragedy, Timon of Athens, which curses the corrupting power of gold, and the struggle for humanism in Shakespeare's creative work was close to us in the days of the Great Patriotic War, and the front-acting brigades and masters of the artistic word played Shakespeare's works on the front line. Varim Papazian, in the role of Othello. Judging by the number of performances, Othello enjoys the greatest popularity among Shakespeare's plays among our directors and actors. Let us mention such outstanding performers of the Venetian Morale as A. A. Ostashchev, Moscow, Mali Theatre, 1936, Georgian actor Akaki Korava, Armenian actors Papazian, Narsayan, Tsinukian, Uzbek actor Aberkadoyatov, Tajik actor Kasimov, Ossetian actor Thapsiev. The Soviet theater forever rejected the primitive interpretation of this play as a tragedy of jealousy, and saw in it primarily a tragedy of deceived confidence, and above all, heard in it the anthem of the love of Mazur Othello and the Venetian Desdemona, heard in it the affirmation of the natural quality of people. The bright scenic images of Hamlet were created by A.V. Polyakov in Voronezh. The production of V.Butov, 1941, the Armenian actor Vagarsh Vagarshan, Yerevan, Sundokian Theatre, 1944, the Belarusian Russian actor P.S. Molchanov, the production of V.Butov, Vitebsk, 1946. The intrusive interpretation of King Lear as a tragedy of the knowledge of the cruel world surrounding Shakespeare, W.O.S. Mikoels, Moscow, State Jewish Theatre, 1936. An outstanding Shakespearean performance is the production of King Lear, created by V. Butov in the Tatar Theatre in Kazan in 1945. The Soviet theater seeks in its Shakespearean plays not to create separate, albeit bright, but isolated portraits, but to create performances that express the spirit of the work as a whole. With respect to the ensemble, the productions of A. Popov, The Taming of the Shrew, the Central Theater of the Red Army, Moscow, U. Zavadsky, Ojello, Mossovet Theater, Moscow are remarkable. The performance, Romeo and Juliet at the Belarusian Yanka Kupala Theater in Minsk, production by L. Litvinov, 1945, is very interesting in terms of the integrity of the ensemble. The Soviet theater in practice has proved that Shakespeare does not have so-called secondary roles. There are no casual but empty episodes. The Soviet audience is also close to Shakespeare's sunny, light comedies, his Falstaffian laughter. It is not for nothing that the play, A Lot of Noise from Nothing, staged by I. Rappaport, has been staged for 10 years from the stage of the Vakhtangov Theater. It can be safely said that not only in quantitative terms, but also in ideological and artistic interpretation, Soviet Shakespearean plays occupy the first place in the world. Much has been done by our translators of Shakespeare. Remarkable translations of Shakespeare's sonnets by S. Marshak, Shakespeare's translations of Boris Pasternak, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Antony and Cleopatra are peculiar and profound. The translation of Hamlet made by Mikhail Ozinsky is strong in its clear, logical harmony. She did a lot in her creative work on the texts of Shakespeare. Shchepkina Kupernik, the pen of which belongs the translation of the 13 plays of the great playwright. Shakespeare's works are read and reread by millions, and each time they find new wealth. Playwrights, writers, poets learn from Shakespeare. The great Gorky wrote, "A teacher, a figure, a builder of a new world, and should be the main hero of modern drama, and in order to portray this hero with the proper strength and brilliance of the word, one must learn to write plays from old, unsurpassed masters of this literary form, and most of all Shakespeare." M. Gorky, On Literature, Articles and Speeches, 1923-1936, ed., supplemented by Soviet Publishing House, Moscow, 1937, p. 162. Once Heine, objecting to those representatives of classicism who accused Shakespeare in the absence of a track of unity, place, time and action, said that Shakespeare has three oneness. The unity of the place for him is the whole world, the unity of time is eternity, the unity of action is humanity. Shakespeare was and remains a faithful friend of advanced humanity. Therefore, the popularity enjoyed in our country by a great humanist, playwright and poet, who found his second homeland in the Soviet Union, is understandable.